Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome back to the Reaktor 6 tutorial series. We're going to have a look at the various types of waveforms today, and we're going to use the bento box oscillator. This is probably the most common oscillator that you're going to come across in Reaktor 6. It's part of the core package, and it's a really great tool for demonstrating lots of the basic features of synthesis, and we'll also learn some little tricks and tips as we go along in the use of Reaktor itself. If you're enjoying this series and you want to help support my channel, check out the Patreon and YouTube channel member links below. You'll be able to download all of the racks and projects that evolve over the course of this series. Okay, let's get up and running. Here we've got our basic Sawtooth wave. And I've just seen that in my spectrum analyzer down below, I want the full range of frequencies. So what is a sawtooth? Well, it's probably the synthesist's best friend because it contains all the harmonics, even and odd. And as you can see, as we go, we've got our fundamental at 65 Hertz here. And then each one of these peaks is basically a harmonic. In other words, another 65 added on top. That's what a harmonic is. So if you count these things across, that's going to be about 130, and this one's going to be about 195, and so on, all the way up. The reason why sawtooths are so great for subtractive synthesis is because subtracting parts of the volume of the amplitude of each of these harmonics is what generates tone. That's basically all that tone is. It's just the combination of multiple different harmonics. So sawtooth gives you this great palette with which you can play with sound. At the other end of the spectrum, the simplest tone and the most difficult to make sound interesting is the sine wave. This has a single harmonic right down at the fundamental. Here we are at 65 Hertz, and there are no overtones whatsoever. Sine waves are great as modulators because they just go up and down constantly and they don't do anything else, but they're pretty terrible as tone tools. The other two types of waves, triangles and squares, are very closely related. They both contain only odd harmonics, and the difference between a triangle and a square wave is the rate of attenuation. Triangle harmonics, the overtones of a triangle wave, tail away faster than a square wave does. Let's have a look at a square wave first. Now, it's very common when you're dealing with square waves to see them referred to as pulses, because a square wave is a pulse with a 50% duty cycle. We'll deal with that term over the course of today, but for now I'm just going to press a note. Here it is. Here's our square wave. Here are all of our harmonics. So they're only odd harmonics. In other words, if the fundamental's at 65, the first harmonic is going to basically miss out the even harmonic at 130 and jump straight to 195. Let's have a look at this. I'll just turn it down a bit. So here's our first overtone at 195 Hertz. Then we would miss out 260 and hit the next harmonic at 315. No, 325. Oops. Here we are. Now, if you have a look at the rate of attenuation of this square wave, here they are. If I switch to a triangle wave, you're basically going to get exactly the same number of harmonics, but they're going to tail away faster. So just basically take a note of that angle. It's maybe 20 degrees. Let's dial up a triangle wave. And now they tail away faster, and you can hear it's a softer tone. It's closer to a sine wave. It's closer to that soft single purity of the single harmonic. Each one of those basic waveforms, they're really easy to generate. They have very simple mathematical formulae. I'm not going to go into the maths behind them today, but they're really simple and easy to generate, and the vast majority of analog synthesizers are capable of generating all four different types of wave. This oscillator can not only generate all four, but it can also generate mixes of the waves. So here, for instance, we have a combination, a mixture of a triangle wave and a sawtooth. And if you have a look at it in the oscilloscope, you see exactly that. It's a little bit of both, a little bit of the saw wave and a little bit of the triangle. Let's bring our internal oscilloscope into the picture as well. We'll take an output from the oscillator. If I ever say oscilloscope when I'm talking about oscillators, I'm sorry. It's one of my most common mispronunciation, whatever it is. And here's it in our internal oscilloscope. You can see that because the output's coming directly out of the oscillator, it's bypassing the amplifier, and so the signal's there all the time. It's the combination of the envelope and the amplifier that's allowing us to have this gate, press the key, hear the sound, let the key go, turn the sound off. If I wanted to have this sound going constantly while I was talking to you, I could just turn the amplifier up. Because it's the envelope's effect of turning the amplifier up basically manually that's allowing us to hear that sound, but we can override that behavior whenever we want. Just going to pause our examination of the various waveforms for a moment, just to get rid of something that's been mildly irritating me about this default rack. We don't need the audio in block. Audio in is primarily for when you're using Reaktor as an effects unit. Say if you wanted to use this as a distortion unit or a chorus, you need to send an audio signal into it, like something out of your guitar, for instance. In that case, you would add Reaktor as an insert effect on one of your channel strips and then send the audio in via this block. That's not the case here. We're generating our own tones, so we don't need to see this block. Ordinarily, I would right-click delete. Most of the blocks you can see, we have the ability to delete them. You don't with the audio in, because it's one of the core components of Reaktor, the input and output. They're there all the time. But there is a way that we can hide them. We can do it using panel sets. Over on our left-hand side, one of the tabs is called Panel Sets, F4. There we go. This allows us to configure a view. This is a pure view of a rack. So panel sets exist within a rack. You can have any number of them. I can define a panel set, for instance, that hides the input and output blocks. You have to bear in mind that the output block is being used. We have connections into it, but they're very default. If basically I never get rid of this stereo block and I always have these cables attached, I can safely hide the output block. I don't really need to see it. It's kind of superfluous to requirements. Having hidden those blocks, I could then define that as a panel set and call it basic. And this could now basically behave as the default view for my rack. I can also save the rack in this configuration. I save it as 003 oscillator with env panel set. That's now a new alternative for me. If I don't want to see those blocks, I can just pull that rack in. If I reconfigured these blocks and had them appearing in a different order, I could save that panel set and call that, let's say, alternative. And now I can switch between these panel sets at will. They are view only. So if I, for instance, delete one of the cables, let's delete the output cable from this oscillator and switch panel sets. You can see here in the second panel set, the input cable to the VCA has also disappeared. So it's a purely representative view. It's not having any functional effect on the rack. Get rid of that second one, we don't need it. Okay then, back to waveforms. We've had a very brief look at each of the 4 different types of waveform, and you can see me cycling through them. Let's say I wanted to generate a sawtooth wave with this particular oscillator. I'd have to scroll up until I could kind of visually see that the sawtooth was there and make sure that I had it exactly selected. It's a little bit fiddly. Well, there's a way to basically override that behavior and get to a sawtooth straight away. I can take one of my alternative outputs. So the output port itself represents exactly what you see in this view, and you can see that in the oscilloscope. But if I throw that away, and instead we switch to an explicit sawtooth connection into our VCA, let's move the VCA back where it should be, and also send that into the input of our oscilloscope, we've now got exactly a sawtooth. So that's a nice convenient way to get exactly to the wave that you want. It doesn't matter what this output viewer looks like now, because this is only represented at the output port. Now the black sheep of the waveform family is the pulse wave. I said earlier that a pulse wave and a square wave are the same thing when the pulse wave's duty cycle is at 50%. So we need to define what that means. What do we mean by duty cycle? Basically we mean the amount that the wave is high. Can you see on the oscilloscope, waves have positive values, everything above this line. The line represents 0 volts, and we have negative control voltages, and all waves operate in both directions. So with our square wave, which we're going to plug in manually now, we have exactly that behaviour. The control voltage is positive exactly the same amount of time as it's negative. Now this could be plus 0.5, minus 0.5, plus 1, minus 1, irrelevant. That's only basically dealing with the amplitude or the volume of the wave. The important thing is that the positive and the negative are perfectly mirrored. But that's only one of the widths of a pulse wave. So if I vary this pulse width knob to anything other than 12 o'clock or 0, you're going to see the relative widths of these two offsets, the positive and negative, change. This is the duty cycle. So if I turn it clockwise, now the positive signal lasts longer than the negative signal. Let's turn it up and hear what this sounds like as we go. Classic analog synth sound. Now it doesn't matter tonally whether your positive is longer than your negative, or exactly the inverse. Now the negative is longer than the positive. This is exactly the same sound, if I got the numbers perfect, as that. The important thing is that there's a difference in the positive and negative. The wave is now imbalanced, and if you watch it in the spectrum analyzer, I'll get this sound going constantly in the background, but we're not hearing it. I've just turned the master output down. So we can observe this thing in the oscilloscope without listening to it. In the spectrum analyzer, you can see as the pulse width changes, the dramatic effect we're having on all of the overtones of the wave. So it has a really, really significant effect on the output. And that represents as this tonal colouring. Modulation of pulse width for sonic effect, to sound good to our ears, is really, really common. So let's play with a couple of features in Reaktor to modulate this thing dynamically. The first example I'm going to show you is with the velocity output of the note-in block. So here we're dealing with pressing keys on the keyboard. This goes back into manual mode. Every time I press a key on the keyboard, I'm generating a velocity. I'm generating note-on data to tell me what the pitch of the note is, and velocity data to tell the Reaktor how hard I've hit the key. And we can take an output from velocity. Here it is. Let's take that and we'll feed it into both the oscilloscope and a modulation input on the oscillator called modulation input A. So A and B are really common. Most blocks have them. If you look on some of these other blocks, you'll very often see A and B input. They're basically like modulation presets. If I activate mod A by clicking the little A button at the top of the block, now you can see all these different sliders that appear next to the controls. If I increase the value of some of these sliders, you're going to get this little black triangle. And this represents an amount of modulation or change that's allowed to be applied to one of the controls in this block when a signal is received at input A. So input A is waiting for some kind of control voltage to arrive. When it does, it's going to basically virtually turn this knob either up or down, depending on whether I've applied positive modulation or negative modulation. And the amount that I turn this thing up, you can see as I increase as I basically move the slider up, that's specifying how much change I'm going to allow to be applied to this control. So if I apply maximum modulation, I'm going to set my default position on the knob itself to 0. So ordinarily, this thing's going to output a square wave, but the control voltage that comes from the velocity of the key that I hit is going to add some control voltage, some modulation amount onto this default position of duty cycle positive, the same as negative. A great way to demonstrate this is to bring in a second scope. So I'm going to plug in a second scope into this rack. Now, if you want to add new components to a rack, you can right-click duplicate and that will work perfectly well. But today I'm going to use a different approach. I'm going to head back over to my player. You basically need to make sure that something in the player is in focus. This is a kind of clunky thing in Reaktor, because what I need to do is click on the background of the rack itself and press enter on my keyboard. And then this search box will appear. And this allows me to now type in text, and it'll find all of the installed blocks that have this word. This, by the way, is one of the great things about these 3-letter acronyms. If you're looking for oscilloscope, if you're looking for oscillators, for instance, you can just type in OSC. And because every oscillator is prefixed with oscillator OSC, you're going to find them all. So here's our scope. I can now single click that, and it adds a second scope into the rack. So what I'm going to do is I've got my velocity output from my note-in module coming into the lower scope, and I'm going to set this to free view. The upper scope is going to take an output from the pulse wave, and I'm just going to scale that so that we can see something sensible. Now, can you see this really unusual behavior in the scope at the moment? It's because the modulation amount of this input, the mod A input, is at basically maximum. It looks like it's at 1. I'm going to press a key on my keyboard really lightly. Now the modulation amount just plummeted. So 0, which is here, represents basically no velocity. Every time I hit a key, the harder I hit the key, the modulation amount is going to go up. So this line here represents a small amount of control voltage that's being applied to the mod input. That modulation amount is in turn turning this pulse width knob up to this black triangle. I'm going to press a key slightly harder now. I pressed it quite a lot harder actually, because you see it, saw it go all the way up to the top. Let's get somewhere in the middle. There we go. So it took me a couple of goes to get a control voltage amount that's somewhere in the middle of that range. This little black triangle is constantly identifying the current control voltage that's appearing at this input. So the note-in block, once it's generated that velocity amount, carries on outputting exactly this control voltage change, and it's manifesting in a change of the pulse width. Here you can see quite a wide pulse width, very gentle key, and approaching a square wave, hit the key really hard, and we're back to a very, very wide duty cycle at the top, narrow duty cycle at the bottom, which gives us this incredibly thin, kind of reedy sound. You can see it in the master oscilloscope as well. So that's an example of positive modulation being applied. I'm now just going to spam this C on the keyboard. Depending on how hard I hit the key, you're going to get all those different modulation amounts. Now, can you tell it's really hard for me to not hit the key hard enough? It's very, very sensitive, and for us to hear anything, it's immediately applying a lot of control voltage change. It's because I set this modulation amount to maximum. If I dial that back a little bit to make it less violent, now no matter how hard I hit the key, the modulation amount is never going to max out. We're never going to get that very, very thin kind of reedy nasal sound, and I've got a greater control over the tonal kind of colour of the tone of the keys. Another very common thing to do, let's disengage the velocity output, is to take a modulation off the pitch of the note in. So this is called key tracking. If I take an output from the note from the pitch port and send that into mod A instead, and let's have the same control go into the scope. Now if I play very low keys on the keyboard, we're going to get a small control voltage change. So this is going to look something like a square wave. Doesn't matter how hard I hit the key, you're always going to get the same output. If I press a very high key on the keyboard, I'm going to have to zoom in to make some sense of that. But if I zoom in far enough, you can see that we've now got a very wide pulse width. So the majority of the control voltage is at positive, and a small amount of it is at negative. And this is really common because what it basically means is your higher keys are going to have that brittle kind of nasal effect, And lower down on the keyboard, you're going to get a fatter kind of square wave sound. As opposed to big fat bloff. Last little demonstration, just to drive the point home, is to take a feed off the modulation wheel instead. So now it's completely dynamic. And I press the key, and I move my modulation wheel up and down. You can't physically see it, but I'm just basically playing with the mod wheel on my keyboard. That's a good place to stop. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Please hit like if you did. I'll see you for the next one. Thanks a lot.